No, lovely.
It was very short notice for you.
Yeah, it was.
It's very nice that you came, though.
Well, Otto's very nice. He's good at convincing. Yeah, no, it was, yeah, and the fact that I could bring my daughter made it so much easier, yeah.
Is it the first time for her in Holland? Is it the first time for you?
No, I was here in November for prize giving, so yeah, I thought, I'll come back, it was nice. Yeah.
Yeah, you have lovely weather.
I know, we've been really lucky with the weather.
Yeah.
And it's not as hot as it was actually. So
I read your book in like speed reading, which is very easy because it's like in poem written. I did finish Moonrise. I'm not yet finished with one.
Okay.
But I'm very excited. Where do you get the inspiration of it? Because you have written a whole lot of books, not just these two, but these two came out in the Netherlands, were translated. And where do you get your inspiration from?
Interesting that both of the books that you have read are from TV.
Okay.
So I saw a documentary about conjoined twins, which is why I wrote one. I was sort of fascinated by these twins, Tippy and Grace, and who are from Minnesota. And then I saw a documentary when I was 15 years old about someone on death row and about the last 14 days of his life. And I was so affected by that I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. And so even though that documentary I watched many years ago, you know, that was still the inspiration. So yeah, so two of them documentaries, but just stuff, I suppose, that happens. Yeah.
Have you seen Making a Murder on Netflix as well?
I loved it.
Yeah. It reminded me so much, Moonrise, of that series.
Yeah, and I mean, everything you read just, it makes you, it's so fascinating and so heartbreaking how unjust that American justice system is. How broken the system is and how skewed towards, I mean, I say it in the book, but it's much better to be rich and guilty than poor and innocent, because you're much more likely to go to prison if you're innocent but actually poor. And of course, if you're someone of colour, then add that to the mix and your chances are very slim. And it also made me think of the fact that we do have a jury system which is so unfair, and people can be pressured into making decisions they don't want to make. And there's loads of other stuff actually on iPlayer, new stuff to do with people on death row that you should try and look at. What is it called? If I have your info, I'm going to send you the link to it.
I will give it to you.
Yeah, because it's really good. It's about jury systems where 10 people on the jury think, right, that person should be given the death penalty, and then one person says no, but you only need one person to say no, or two people, and they say no, but then everyone else convinces them, and it's like, how can you convince people to go for the death penalty? Like, I don't understand that, and that's where you start to think that systems where there is no jury would be better, because you have someone who's qualified to make a decision.
And you have like 12 Angry Men, I believe, a very old movie.
Have you seen that?
I have seen it.
Brilliant, isn't it?
Then you see how weird it is that these people make a decision about something they don't know. They haven't studied for it, and they just have to make a decision with people they don't know.
Yeah, with all their prejudices. You know, all the prejudices that come with being a person.
It's just strange. And now in your books and in all the documentaries, you see that there are consequences to that, and people's lives end for that, and it's not really fair. It's very frustrating.
But it's a big, and in the States it's a bigger problem because you have such massive numbers within that are incarcerated, because it's such a big business. Like, people are making money from it, so they're outsourcing it, and so it's valuable to people to have people in prison, to find reasons to incarcerate. So it's also corrupt.
That's my favorite.
Because how do you get all the information from all the criminal process? And you also have in jail I forgot his name, but the man who does the execution. How do you get all the information?
It was just so many. I just read gazillion books, really. I think I read between 40 and 50 books. I was so obsessed with the topic. A great book is Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, which he is a human rights activist in the States, and he writes in a lot of detail about those types of things. Clive Stafford Smith runs Reprieve, which is an organisation that tries to get people out of Guantanamo Bay and off death row, and he writes in a great detail about that. But also I read a book by a guy who was a warden, so someone called Donald Cabana, who he ran a prison and he had to execute people. So looking at it from the inside and how that impacted him and his family being the person that's overseeing this, and him trying to, like, very, very poignant moments in his memoir where he was saying, I have to choose people who want to strap a man down, but they don't want to do it too much. Like, how do you choose that person who's willing to do it but doesn't want to do it? And those kind of moral dilemmas. So I read about 1 million books, and then every documentary that I could watch, I watched it. So Making a Murderer, and of course 14 Days in May, which was the really important one that I had seen when I was 15. I can't even remember all of them, just like
you mentioned some in the because it's very interesting that you put like both sides, the one whose relative is on the death row and the one who is executing it. You put them together, and they kind of collide, but in sort of way they get one another, because both sides don't have really a choice. And it was very interesting to read for me.
Because I think that mostly we read about people who are impacted by crime, but not people who are impacted by crime because they are close to it, rather than being the actual victims of it. So I was interested in that, and just the idea of like creating a whole new set of victims. So you have this family who've lost someone, and the justice is to have another family lose someone. There's this documentary that I said I need to send you the link to. There's one really interesting scene in that where the family of the man who was murdered pay for the daughter of the executed man to come to his execution, because she cannot even afford to come to her dad's execution. So she comes with her little child to see her dad before he's executed. And the family of the victim pay for that. And they didn't want him executed. They said, it's not going to bring us any closure. This is not helpful to us. In fact, we would be the opposite. We would say we want him to be commuted to life. And the prison service said, they're not interested. Because they understood the pain of losing someone, and they didn't want this girl to lose her father in the same way that this woman had.
They
lost
have
her
been
husband.
through it. They don't want another person to go through it. Then a little bit about one. You have Tippy and you have Grace. Who is more like you, Tippy or Grace, you think? Because they're similar, but they are different.
Yeah, I think they're both. I think every character is me, basically. It's disguised in some way. Stop it. I think probably Grace, because Grace thinks a lot but doesn't say what she's thinking, whereas Tippy tends to speak. Like, Grace doesn't even know that when they're in therapy, Tippy is actually talking. Like, Tippy is actually using the therapy session to talk about things that matter, because Grace instead ruminates on it, and it's an internal dialogue that she's having, whereas Grace is having the internal, whereas Tippy speaks out and is prepared to argue, and is also prepared for conflict. And Grace doesn't like conflict. Grace doesn't want to hurt people, and I think I'm like that. But I would like to be more like Tippy, where I'm prepared to have conflict in order to get what I want.
Okay. Why did you decide to write out of Grace's point of view and not Tippy, or maybe both?
I think because, as I said, that Tippy says what she means, says what she feels. So there's no. She's never hiding anything, whereas Grace is so internal that she was the character who needed to speak to us because it's the internalized thoughts. Whereas I think Tippy's thoughts would almost be the same as her what she's saying vocally. I did try to write the character of Tippy, but ultimately I just thought the book is about the fact that conjoined twins are separate people. So for me to then do it from the other perspective, well, what am I saying? I'm saying we need the other person's perspective because they're part of a package, and that wasn't the message. So it didn't make sense in terms of the message I was trying to send to have them both speak.
And you have like the main problem is of course that they are conjoined and they don't have the resources or the money to pay for everything and medical bills. But then you also have their sister Dragon. I always forget her real name.
Yeah, is it Nicola? I don't even remember her real name. I think it's Nicola.
I don't know. I would have said. And then you also have like her ballet and dieting and trouble with eating. So you have multiple problems within just the main problem. Besides that, why did you decide to include also just other problems?
just think because that's life. You know, I think that if you have a family, and the core, the beginning of that dysfunction in that family really starts with the father who's an alcoholic. So that stems her eating disorder and what's going on with Tippy and Grace, perhaps emotionally, stemming from really living in that dysfunction of alcoholism. So I think other people have said, oh, and she's added alcoholism, but actually alcoholism is probably the major driving force in the relationships in that family. And I just think, yeah, it's life, that every individual has their own hidden world, and so I just, and also with Dragon, it was that Dragon was the non-child, because she was the child that didn't have the unusual anatomy. She felt sidelined by that, so they felt unusual and strange, but she felt not part of something. So I think it would make sense that she would have her own sort of identity issues, even though in terms of bodily identity she should have been okay. Actually, she had her own bodily issues, as a lot of teenagers do, which is why I think teenagers relate to the book, is because you're growing and your body is changing and you feel like, people don't look at me, like I'm changing and I look weird, and so they can relate to that idea of people like watching you, and so Conjoined is just sort of taking it, I suppose, to the extreme of how that might feel. But yeah, I know I also, write about the fact that Yasmin has HIV and John is from this dysfunctional family where he lives with his stepfather, and where are the parents? But I suppose for me growing up, that was a reality of the friendships I had, that everybody was coming from some place of difficulty, and any family that pretends that they don't have those things,
then you would stop me there.
I'm suspicious of that. What's really going on if you're you're pretending that you've got no problems.
And usually there are bigger problems. And I love to see how everybody, because everybody has their own thing, and I love to see how everybody copes with it in its own way, and presents itself different to the world. And because you have like Jasmine, who is like, well, I have this, but okay, I don't mind talking about it, but she sort of does, of course,
and it doesn't define her. And I think that's the key for all of these issues for me, was that I didn't want any of the disability or the eating disorder or the illness to define any of these characters, because in reality it doesn't define us. Any of those things don't define people. It just happens to be something we live with, or something that is a particular challenge. But to be defined by disability, or to be defined by a mental disorder, or whatever it is, I think it's only the other people who do the defining. We don't define ourselves in that way, but other people might define us.
And you worry about how they define you and how you want to be defined. Then maybe a strange question, but if you would be a conjoined twin, who would you want to be conjoined with?
Come on.
Well, the reason I wrote it really was because I had just had my daughter, and I wore her everywhere, I had to carry her. So I thought, people think being conjoined is strange, but actually I don't want to be separated from her. I don't even want her on the other side of the room. I want to feel her next to me. I think I have somewhat had an experience of kind of being joined to someone. Obviously when you're pregnant, it's like you are literally carrying another human being. Joined to another person, would find it really challenging, because it's not my normal, it's not within my kind of experience, so no one. But if I was born that way, I'm sure it would be different.
A little bit about your writing. Do you have plans for another book?
Yeah, I've just finished, almost. I'm going to send it to my editor next week. So, yeah, another YA novel in verse. I really like the form. It takes me ages, but I really like it. And then maybe something younger, maybe sort of 5 to 8 years old, and then maybe an adult, but definitely all the time to be working on a teen book. I was a teacher for a really long time, and I love teenagers, and I like capturing a character at that moment where they have to be their own moral compass, and that's what you can do with YA in the way that you can't necessarily do with slightly younger or adult, because they've been their own moral compass for a really long time. I like writing for that age group, because you can catch that. yeah, and then the stakes are pretty high for that reason as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is it about? Can you tell us a little bit?
It's about a woman who suffers from, doesn't suffer from, I don't like that word, who lives with
Yeah.
Can we get two goes each?
Okay.
and she befriends a young girl, not quite realising that she too is not young. So she befriends her as though they are peers. So they have a friendship that would be a friendship
Can I
that
have two goes?
two young people would have, but she happens to be older.
Okay.
You have two goes because we
The
made
woman
them
is sort of
two.
trying to remember because she forgets a lot of things, and the young girl is trying to forget because bad things have happened to her. And so they sort of help each other.
No. I need to have two goes.
Sounds
I
interesting.
suppose, yeah.
And you write everything in verse, but
two
it seems to me that
goes. Can you do that?
it's very difficult
Then you can have
to
two.
do. Why did you decide to write in this sort of way? Because I love it, and I think it
That's
really
three.
brings the story along
You have this one.
very intensely and very beautifully. But
You had three.
why did you decide to write?
Because when I wrote my debut, which is called The Weight of Water, and that was in verse, I was living in the States, and it's just a form that people use there. And I mean, I didn't mean to do it. When I started writing the book, it just came out like that, and I thought, oh no, it's in verse, and it's going to be so hard and take so long. Actually, that book was really quick. It took me 6 weeks. But Moonrise took me probably 2.5 years, maybe more in the thinking. So the process is taking me longer the more I do it, because the more I understand what it is I want to do with language and how, and just the paring down. When you're paring and paring and paring down, you've got to come up with lots and lots and lots of scenes. Whereas if you're writing prose, you could have somebody going to the supermarket and it could take you 16 pages.
Yeah.
But if my character's going to the supermarket, that's 1 page, and then I've got to have another idea, like then where are they, and then what's happening, and then what's happening. So that really is the challenge, is sort of coming up with fresh ideas for each poem. So each poem needs to be sort of a self-contained idea, whereas in prose, it can just sort of be part of what came before or after. Even though it is a part of what came before or after, but I also want them to be able to stand by themselves. But what I love about it is that I don't have to do the boring bits. I don't have to do like the character going from home to the cinema.
Yeah.
They're at home, and then they're at the cinema, and then it's 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
And
it all makes sense.
yeah, and then it's the past, and then it's the future, and so I can really play with time, and I can just miss out all the boring bits, which
Yeah, you
is
don't
what I
have
love
to
about it.
describe where they are, how it looks
Yeah,
like.
and if you do that description, you can do it in 4 lines,
Yeah.
and it's just as impactful, I think,
Yeah.
than doing it in more lines. And also what I love is that the white space gives the reader an opportunity to breathe and therefore write some of the story. So those moments of white space, for me, I'm saying to the reader, you fill this gap in. Because I'm not saying something, so you need to decide what it is I'm not saying. Or maybe I don't know what it was that I was going to say, but you need to make a decision about what happens in this white space. So I think it's more of a collaborative process with the reader than prose as well, because you're not sort of spoon feeding the reader every moment. And I like that, because readers have more varied interpretations of my verse novels than they do of my prose novels.
Thank you very much. I think that was it.
That's why you're like that.
That was it?
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much.